So we are here at Kehilat Shiftei Yisrael in Renana, studying Hilchot Shemitah in the garden. Shemitah year is coming up, Tafshin Pei Bet, and we're going to continue where we left off last time. But I'm going to review and summarize to make sure that everybody's on the same page. So let's open up the PowerPoint presentation and present. And let me just go to. Let me share this on the screen. Okay, good. Yafeh. So Erev Tov, Shemitah in the garden, part 2. Okay. If you have any questions, you could write them in on the chat, or feel free to ask. So let us begin. For those of you who have gardens, those of you who have rooftop gardens, those of you who have عציצים, flower pots, in your homes, outside, this is a relevant issue for you to understand. This is an area of Halakha we don't generally deal with. That's why it's so important to focus on the special mitzvah here in Eretz Yisrael for this coming year. So let's begin. First of all, I want to just quickly review something we did last time, and that is, when does Shemitah actually start? So the answer is that Shemitah begins on Aleph Tishrei of Tafshin Pei Bet, which is about 6 weeks from now. However, there's something called Tosefet Shvi'it. Tosefet Shvi'it means that you may not plant even before Shvi'it starts. And for different types of produce or plants, this starts at a different point in time. So this is just a quick review here. Grass should really be planted 3 months before Shemitah, which we've already passed. Minimally, it should be grown a month before. This way you can grow it, and then you can mow it, and then when you continue to manage it and maintain it during the year, you're not causing more growth. Fruit trees in a clod of soil. The final time is actually the 29th of Av, in about 10 days, 15 days. Non-fruit trees in a clod of soil. What I mean by clod of soil is that at the bottom, sometimes, usually we receive trees, we buy them at the mishtala in a pot, and the pot has dirt around it. So if there's dirt around the tree, then you have till the 29th of Elul for a non-fruit tree. What about planting flowers and vegetables? If there's no soil, you have until the 26th of Elul, and if there is soil, really right until Rosh Hashanah. Okay, so these dates are coming up. A person needs to prepare for Shemitah in their garden. These are in terms of planting. But let's move on now. That was just a summary of something we did last time, and let's move on to the next piece. Flower pots and hothouses. How does Shemitah affect flower pots in your home or your garden? So what we're going to try to do this evening is understand practical halakha. What do you need to do? What are you not allowed to do? But we also want to build foundations and understanding so that you become more knowledgeable and literate when it comes to the laws of Shemitah. So the Talmud Yerushalmi in Masachet Orlah Perek Aleph Halakha Bet raises the following discussion. Ilan shenatu betoch habayit chayav be'orla. Let's say you have a tree planted inside your house, literally on the grounds of your house, meaning it's inside the house, but it's in the dirt of the ground. And this is similar, in fact, to a hothouse, but let's say it's in your actual house. Is this tree obligated in the laws of mitzvot tatzliot ba'aretz? So when it comes to orla means that you can't consume fruit for the first 3 years. That it definitely applies. Doesn't matter where a tree is grown, you are chayav in orla, and you may not touch the fruit for the first 3 years. What about trumot u'masrot, or taking tithes? So there we say, well, listen, the principles of trumot u'masrot only apply in the field. And if you plant something in your house, under the roof of your house, that is not in the field, and therefore it doesn't apply. As it says, Eit kol tvot zarecha hayotzei hasadeh. Now what about Shemitah? Does Shemitah apply under the roof of your house, or is it only in the field? And here we have a safek in the Yerushalmi uvashvit tzricha tichtiv. By the Yerushalmi, we have a question. On the one hand, it says vishavta haaretz, the land needs to rest, and this applies to the entirety of the land, whether it's in your house or outside. It also says you should not plant in your field. So we don't know what to do about Shvi'it, and ultimately we have a doubt. What happens when you plant inside a house? And we're going to see why this is relevant very practically in just a second. This is one issue. Planting inside a house, shvi'it, we don't know what to do. Let's go to the next piece here. Let's talk about flower pots for a second. Now, flower pots, the reason we're bringing these two things together, because we're going to combine a discussion about planting in your house with flower pots, which might be inside your house and outside your house. And we'll see what the conclusion is in just a second. Now, in Halakha, there are two types of flower pots. There's an atzitz nakuv, which is the one with the perforated holes. And the second one is atzitz she'eino nakuv. You see on the bottom here in the middle, the flower pot, the glass jug, which certainly has no holes in it. What about a potted plant with a plate on the bottom? That's assumed to be atzitz she'eino nakuv. It's considered to be unperforated. Now, what is the halakha in terms of perforated pots and non-perforated pots? Generally, when we put things into our garden, we usually have holes in the bottom. Sometimes even in our homes, the pots have holes in the bottom for drainage. We want them to suck up moisture or nutrients from the ground. We want roots to develop. So this is something we need to look at. So the basic halakha is that when it comes to perforated pots, they are kikarka. It's atzitz nakuv kikarka dami. We have two sources here in Masachet Demai and Masachet Shabbat Abtzadihei. In Masachet Demai it says, atzitz nakuv harei ze ke'aretz. If you have a perforated pot and it is sitting in your garden and it's touching the ground, look what happens on the left here. The roots grow through the holes and into the ground. Anything you have in a pot outside, it's as if it's in the ground itself. There is no difference between these things. So anything you can't do in Shemitah, you cannot do in your perforated pot. Another example of this is just another application in Hilchot Shabbat. If I were to pick up this pot on the left side here, on this PowerPoint, and pick it up from the ground, I would be chayav on tolesh. Tolesh is a tolada. It's a derivative melacha of kotzer. You're not allowed to do that on Shabbat. You're removing something from its source of nutrients. So tolesh me'atzitz nakuv chayav, v'she'enu nakuv patur. If it's non-perforated, it'd be patur. You shouldn't be doing this on Shabbat, but you're not violating an isur d'oraita. So what about during Shemitah? So when it comes to Hilchot Shemitah, again, there's very little discussion about this, with whether perforated pots or non-perforated pots. So we don't know what to do. So let me share with you halakha l'maaseh in three different locations, three different situations. So in the garden we assume if you have different types of pots, it's prohibited to plant, but permitted to maintain just like everything else in the garden. We'll explain soon. So what do I mean by this? If you have a perforated pot in the garden, it's asur midoraita to plant in it. And if you have a non-perforated pot, it's asur midrabanan to plant in it. Planting is prohibited for any pot that you have in your garden, a flower pot, you want to put a tree in a pot, doesn't matter. Always prohibited because it's outside. And we assume that something outside either draws moisture, it doesn't matter whether it's hold or not hold, it's a problem. What about other type of maintenance? We're going to talk about that in just a little bit. Whatever we say about maintenance for pots, we're going to say the same thing about maintenance in the garden itself, something that's actually in the ground. What about inside the house? So if you have something inside your house, a pot inside your house, you are allowed to plant in your house or to maintain that pot. Why? The answer is as follows. Normally, first of all, in your house, you have an atzitz she'eino nakuv. You have a flower pot that does not have any holes in it. That's number one, because there's no reason to have holes in it, and you normally have a plate under it. Number two is that it's inside the house. And when it's inside the house, we had a safek, what happens inside the house as it is. So between these two things combined, on the one hand, something being under the roof of your house, and something being in a non-perforated pot, you may grow plants inside your house during the year of Shemitah. You want to grow herbs, you want to grow rosemary, you want to grow nana. You could do it inside your house in a pot, no problem. You could water it, you could prune it, you could do anything you want to this pot. What about on the roof or of the porch of your house? Is that considered like inside your house, or is that considered like outside your house? So here we have a machloket achronim. The Rav Avad Yosef and Yalkut Yosef actually quotes two opinions here. He says, on the one hand, gag, anything that's on your porch, on your mirpeset, on the roof, that's not roofed, Some say this is just like everything that's outside of the outside the house. There is kedushat shvi'it because there's no roof. And others say no. Whatever you have in the gag is it's like it's removed because it's not actually in the ground. It could be on the third or the fourth or the fifth floor. And there's no shvi'it. Shvi'it does not apply to them. In general, Rav Melamed and Rav Rimon, they paskin stringently that anything that is in a flower pot, but it's outside on your mirpeset or on your roof, we treat it just like a flower pot that's on the ground in the garden. And so you're not going to be able to plant in those places. And we'll talk about maintenance of these flower pots in just a little bit. But again, if you want to be lenient, if you want to follow the lenient path, not follow the lenient path, you want to have things simple, take all your flower pots inside the house, and then you can do anything you want with them. Anything outside, you cannot plant, and we'll see that certain types of maintenance are permitted. Not flower pots with holes in them in the dirt, that on the garden, but anything that's non-perforated. You'll see there are certain types of maintenance that you could engage in. Okay, I'm just going to stop here for 1 second just to see how everybody's doing here. Okay, can everybody hear me? Thumbs up. Yafem. Oh, good. Let's continue where we are. And again, if you have any specific questions, feel free to ask. Good. Let's go to the next slide. What about hothouses? Hothouses are actually a chamamah. Chamamah from chom, from heat, is actually a. You can't hear me? Oh, okay. A chamamah is a hothouse, and this is actually one of the ways to get around Shemitah. Anything that's grown in a hothouse, we assume does not have the holiness of Shemitah fruit. So if you grow fruit in the hothouse, you could eat it without being concerned about how you dispose of it. You could throw it out even if you want to. There might be an issue about tashchit. You also can plant in there. Okay. Again, what's the reason a hothouse? Why is it permitted? Because a hothouse is roofed, and we already spoke about that. There's a safek about what happens when something's roofed. But in this case, by a hothouse, Yalkut Yosef, Rabbi Yosef explains, they put down a very thick plastic under the hothouse, under the plant, so that it doesn't touch the ground. So it's totally removed from the ground. It's inside the house. It's ki'ilu, like it's like an atzitze enu nakuv under a roof, and therefore you're allowed to plant, you're allowed to maintain, you're allowed to garden, you're allowed to eat this without having any concerns with Shemitah. Okay, we continue to the next slide. Now let's review from last time what we spoke about with regards to what are the different prohibitions when it comes to Shemitah. So there are milachot deoraita. There are Torah prohibitions. These are called avot. Okay, these are the fathers. These are the major categories. Now, the 4 or 5 things mentioned in the Torah that you're not allowed to do is number 1, seeding and planting, zorea, harvesting, which is kotzer, pruning, which is zomer, gathering fruit, which is botzer, and then also plowing, choresh, which we consider a doraita, even though it's not mentioned explicitly in the Torah. 4 or 5 prohibitions that you're not allowed to do from a Torah perspective. But there are also milachot midrabanan, things that are prohibited from a rabbinic standpoint. That includes grafting and watering, fertilizing, cutting back growth, weeding, putting on pesticides, digging holes, removing rocks, mowing the lawn. All of these things are prohibited midrabanan. These are called toladot. But as we'll see, there are going to be certain situations where these are permitted, and that's what we want to try to figure out. Now, what is the difference between the milachot d'Rabanan versus milachot midoraita? So the basic rule is as follows. The Torah prohibitions are prohibited under all circumstances. You may not plant. You cannot harvest. You cannot prune. Those are all prohibited. The rabbinic prohibitions are permitted under certain conditions. The question is, what are they? When are these things permitted? When are they prohibited? So just an interesting idea that Rav Kook mentions in his Sefer Shabbat Haaretz. This is Rav Kook's Sefer that he wrote about Hilchot Shemitah. So he gives us a very important principle, that even the Melachot D'Rabanan are prohibited if you do them bikviut. If you do them in a regular fashion, if you do them on with regularity, even they are prohibited from the Torah. So let's say I want to remove rocks from my garden and I'm constantly doing this on a regular basis. That's called sikul avanim. I'm violating a Torah law in that instance, even though it's not mentioned explicitly in the Torah. What prohibition am I violating? It's not a prohibition. It's actually a mitzvat aseh. Along with all the prohibitions of Shemitah, there's a positive commandment. Vishavta haaretz, and Rav Kook writes that if I'm doing all these things bikviut, I'm violating a positive commandment. This parallels something that we say by Shabbat. Shabbat, and as the Ramban Nachmanides explains in Sefer Vayikra, Perek Gimel, on Shabbat I'm not allowed to do choresh, zorea, kotzer, ma'amer, dash, zorea, all of the melachot. I'm not allowed to do. But the Ramban says beyond all the 39 melachot on Shabbat, if I start moving things around the house, or I want to organize my closet, I want to move rocks in my garden, I want to do things that don't fall into the 39 categories of melacha, the Ramban says, you know what? Those violate the positive commandment of Shabbaton. You have to rest. You have to actively rest on Shabbat. So too the land needs to actively rest during Shnat HaShemitah. Even if I do melachot midrabanan, bikviut, Rav Kook says that I'm violating this d'oraita of mitzvah aseh of vishavta haaretz. Now, so then what is the difference between melachot d'rabanan versus d'oraita? So here we get to a fundamental distinction called la'avruye versus la'akume. Okay? Avruye versus akume. Now, I spelled this incorrectly, but I'll have to fix this afterwards. Now, here we have a source in Masechet Avodah Zarah Daf Nun Amud Bet. So the Gemara is trying to understand why, when it comes to certain rabbinic prohibitions, some seem to be permitted, some are prohibited. Where do we draw the line? And this is exactly the Gemara in Masechet Avodah Zarah. So the Gemara asks, what is different about placing manure that is permitted during the sabbatical year? And what is different about pruning that is prohibited? Why are you allowed to do one and not do the other? So Ravina rejects this suggestion. It's also not a valid question. Are they comparable? The purpose of placing manure is to preserve the tree, and therefore it is permitted. Whereas the purpose of pruning is to enhance the tree, and therefore it is prohibited. So how do we say this in Hebrew? So la'avruye means to strengthen, to enhance the tree. Whereas akume, lahakim, okay, is to maintain. So what we're saying here is that when it comes to the rabbinic prohibitions of Shemitah, which would be fertilizing and watering and grafting and removing rocks, all of these things are only permitted la'akume. They're only permitted to maintain the trees, to maintain the garden, but not to strengthen it, not to enhance. Let me give you a classic example. If I want to fertilize by putting hormones into my garden just to strengthen the trees, I'm not allowed to do that because that's strengthening, okay? That's not permitted. Whereas if I'm doing it just to maintain, if I don't water my trees, if I don't water my garden for 12 months straight, they're going to die. So I need to do maintenance, but I'm not allowed to do strengthening. And Rashi explains in two different places why you're allowed to maintain, but not to strengthen. And the answer is that if you don't do this, so Rashi says in Masechet Avodah Zarah, okume shelo yitkalkel mikamochuhu aval eno mashbicho. So you want to prevent something from becoming destroyed or ruined, but you can't improve it, you can't enhance it. Avruye, where that's machazik, that's strengthening. Rashi also explains, so why are you allowed to do okume? The answer is it's milta de pseida sharu rabanan. When it comes to something, there's going to be a loss, a financial loss. If I don't water my fields, if I don't water my garden, it's going to die. Everything's going to die. I'm going to have to then replant everything. So I'm allowed to do things to maintain the garden so that I don't lose the trees, but I'm not allowed to do things to enhance and to improve the garden. That's the fundamental distinction, which I've summarized here. La'okume is to maintain. La'avruye is to improve, to grow. La'okume is permitted. B'makom hefsed, it's permitted in a case of loss. Okay. Now this distinction might sound to you like splitting hairs, which we have here in the picture. And indeed, it's complicated sometimes to figure out when am I just maintaining my garden, when am I improving or growing my garden, okay? So we're gonna have to talk about this and try to figure out in certain circumstances, how things fall out. Okay, so first of all, a fundamental question is, does this apply to all melachot d'Rabbanan? Is this true by all melachot d'Rabbanan that we make a distinction between maintenance versus strengthening and enhancing? And according to the Rambam, indeed it is the case. The Rambam in Ilchot Shemitah v'Yovel Perek Aleph Halakha Yud says, why do the rabbis allow you to do certain maintenance in the garden? Specifically, again, when it comes to rabbinic prohibitions, if you don't water, if you don't water, the land's going to become barren and salty, I guess. Everything's going to die. Rambam says when it comes to the 4 Torah prohibitions, you can never do those. No conditions. You can never do it. When it comes to the melachot d'Rabbanan, which I shared with you beforehand on the list, if we just go back to what some of them are, the grafting and watering and fertilizing and cutting back road and weeding and pesticides and digging, those things are going to be permitted in order to prevent some stuff from dying. So you could do maintenance. Okay, the Nimuke Yosef in Masachat Moed Katan, he has a different reading. He says basically you're only allowed to do things that are not considered chashuv. Anything that's considered chashuv, you're not allowed to do. Okay, so this is in terms of defining hefsed. So the Rambam says that hefsed applies to all the rabbinic prohibitions. Yimuke Yosef says it only applies to things that are chashuv. We pass like the Rambam that any time that there is hefsed, loss to your trees, you are allowed to do work. We have to figure out what that is in more detail. So we're getting closer to understanding this. Okay, so here we have a fundamental machloket, okay, clash of the titans between the Chazon Ish and Rav Kook. These are 2 of the 20th century Rabbanim who dealt most extensively with Hilchot Shemitah. And Rav Kook, in fact, is lenient in some areas but stringent in others. And here we're going to see an example where Rav Kook is more stringent. So Rav Kook says, he talks about v'chein ein mechavnim. We're going to read this source inside. V'chein ein mechavnim shehu lakutz et hakotzim hayotzim min ha'ailan. You want to remove the thorns. You want to remove things, branches coming out of the ilan that you don't need, that are not helpful or healthy to the fruit. Hamazikim et haperot. And dafka, sometimes they puncture the fruit, and the fruit gets punctured, and then it goes rotten. So are you allowed to cut those branches so that they don't ruin the fruit? Rav Kook says this is prohibited according to all opinions. Even according to those who say that you're allowed to maintain the tree. This is only to help the tree itself. You want to maintain the health of the tree. But anything that's about maintaining the fruit that's on the tree, le'olam asura, you're never allowed to do anything with those things. You don't own the fruit on your own tree. It's hefker. One of the points of Shemitah, as we spoke about last time, is that the fruits on your tree become ownerless. I cannot do anything to maintain them. So I cannot do anything that's good for the fruit. I can only do things that are good for the tree. So to summarize, Rav Kook says you cannot do any work that benefits the fruit, only what keeps the tree vital so that it can produce fruit in the 8th year. The Chazon Ish says differently. The Chazon Ish, here's a picture of him on the right. You see the glasses the Chazon Ish is wearing? Those are now in style. Everybody's wearing those glasses today. Okay, so Ulama Chazon Ish says, Cholek al shitat raya. This is a source in the Rav Rimon Sefer. Even maintenance that is for the sake of the fruit is permitted. And not just for the sake of the tree. So what we're seeing here is that, maintenance is permitted, b'makom hefseid, in a case of loss, but there's a machloket. Is it maintenance for the tree itself, or is it maintenance of the fruit? Okay, so the Chazon Ish says, no, you could also do things for the fruit. Whereas Rav Kook says, no, you can only do things for the tree. Now, there's a very interesting point made by Rav Eliezer Malabed about why the Chazon Ish is more lenient here. You could even do things for the sake of the tree to maintain the fruit. You can't do things to enhance the fruit. You can't put hormones into the tree, for example. But you could do things to enhance to maintain the fruit. So what's the answer? He says because the Chazon Ish is very stringent by heter mechira. Okay, heter mechira is when heter mechira is a very big kula, very big leniency by Shemitah, which means that we sell the lands. Farmers sell their lands to Arabs or to other people living here in Israel, and then they work the land. And because they don't own it, so the holiness of Kedushat Shvi doesn't apply to the fruit. The fruit are like regular fruit in any year, and you could eat it, and you could sell it, you could make money on it, you could do all these things, you can make a business out of it. That's what the farmers want to do. And this is something that Rav Kook, permitted in 1909, and he did this because if he didn't do heter mechira, he felt that the yeshuv in Eretz Yisrael would not maintain itself. Whereas the Chazon Ish was against heter mechira. So he's against heter mechira. So that means there's really nothing to eat in Eretz Yisrael. So he's got to be more lenient in terms of allowing you to maintain the fruit. You could do certain maintenance. La'okame ilana ula'okame pira, according to the Chazon Ish. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So we're building foundations here, getting to the practical things very soon. Okay, so that's the main distinction between the Chazon Ish and Rav Kook. Now we're going to see some practical applications of these laws. Okay, I'm just going to stop and pause for 1 second. Everyone all right here? If you have any questions, feel free to speak up. Okay. Now let's talk about pruning. Okay, pruning is cutting branches in order to strengthen your trees. Here in Ra'anana, we live in a tropical wonderland. Things grow so fast. They overgrow. I mean, if you go on vacation a month later, it's unbelievable what happens to your garden. And you have to constantly maintain it and cut things and prune. So, are you allowed to do this? Pishnat Shemitah. So it says explicitly in Vayikra Perek Kafeh, Sadachah lo tizra, v'char macha lo tizmor. You're not allowed to prune your vineyard. V'char macha lo tizmor. So, based on the Pshat in the Torah, it seems like it's only prohibited to prune your vineyard. Okay, I don't know, most people don't have vineyards. You have other lemons and you have grapefruits and you have lychees, but you don't have vineyards. So do you have to, are you allowed to prune other trees? So basically, the Rambam says in Ochot Shemitah Perek Aleph Bet, there's a bottom source right here. The Rambam says that even the Torah only speaks about vineyard. This is true of all fruit trees, that you are not allowed to plant them. You're not allowed to prune them during the Shemitah year. Rashi in Masachet Moed Katan believes that it's only in Isur D'Rabbanan for other trees. The Rambam says it's in Isur D'Oraita for all trees, for all fruit trees. You're not allowed to prune your fruit trees at all. Machloket Rashi versus the Rambam. Let's go to the next slide. Here we have just a little video here. It's important to understand that specifically by vineyards, there's a real skill. There's a very developed skill of how to prune properly. And just a short video that I'll show you. And the pruning that the Torah is talking about here is skilled pruning. Okay, let's watch a little bit together. Okay, we're not gonna watch the whole thing. Just a. Welcome
all, and thank you for joining today's session. My name
can
is
everybody
Michael.
Just tell me? Can everybody hear the video? Yes, no. Can everybody hear the video? Let me just make sure that. Let me stop share for a second and make sure that I'm going to share sound. Okay. Okay, presentation. Okay, you should be able to hear right now. Can hear. You're just going to get an idea of how
Pruning a grapevine. In today's film, we're going to cover the vine structure, why we prune, the equipment we need when we prune, and I'm going to finish by showing you the two most commonly used methods of pruning, spur and cane pruning. Before we enter any vineyard, we need to make sure that we are aware of the vineyard biosecurity protocols. Each vineyard will have different protocols, but the minimum requirement is to make sure you put your footwear through a chlorine foot bath and that you have thoroughly cleaned your snips with an ethanol solution.
Yeah, okay.
To start, let's talk about the different parts of the vine. The first thing you'll notice is that the vine is trained up and attached to a wire. This wire we refer to as the cordon wire or the fruiting wire. This wire gives the vine some structure and stops it from falling over. Here we have the trunk. This is the main thickened stem that grows up from the ground. Where the vine branches out, we call this area the head or the crown of the vine. This is the point where the vine branches out and forms what we refer to as the cordon. From the cordon, we have spurs growing up and out. And it's from these spurs, we have our canes growing out. On our canes, we have these swollen parts here, and we call these nodes. And it's on the nodes that we have the buds. And then it's from the buds that we get the shoots and the fruit for next year. And if we look very closely here at the very base of this cane, we have the base bud. Pruning is the removal of canes. Here we can see a vine that's been half pruned using the spur pruning method. And I'll just make the last couple of cuts. And there we go. We can see a vine now that's been half pruned using spur pruning, and now the unpruned section over here. And I'll just finish it off now.
Okay. So, what we see here is, it's really a skill, the pruning, and the point of pruning, okay, what type of pruning is prohibited? So Rav Eliezer Melamed explains here in Pruning Halakha, Hazmiras rametra hi chituch hanavim beofen hamo'il litzmichat eitz v'haperot. You're not allowed to prune in a way that enhances the tree, that makes it grow further. He was pruning that vineyard so that the grapes that do grow are going to be much stronger, and that you don't have weak grapes or undeveloped grapes on too many of the cordons or the spruces or on the sprouts or the buds. Any professional gardener knows what they're doing here. But there are other times that you prune. For example, sometimes you cut off branches so that the tree is sick, it's diseased, it's sick. You want to get rid of those branches. So what he says here is midoraita. You're not allowed to prune for the sake of strengthening the fruit and making it grow better. But when it comes to taking off disease stuff, or when it comes to strengthening the tree in the long run, that's only prohibited mid rabanan. What if you prune for other reasons? So if you're cutting diseased branches, okay, this is prohibited mid rabanan. Okay, but again, if it's for the health of the tree, you're allowed to, if there's hefsed, you're allowed to prune there. What about cutting branches that hang into the street? You're also allowed to prune, or it's stopping passerbys from walking by. You can cut those branches off. What about cutting branches for firewood? Also permitted, mutar. Cutting branches for schach? Permitted, mutar. All of these are not the normal reason why you prune. It's not really pruning, it's cutting back, cutting growth. What about cutting branches for aesthetic purposes? Let's say you have a geder chaya, you have a live wall of trees, and it's getting getting too big. So if there's a need, you can cut back for aesthetic purposes, but try to use a shinui. Try to do it in you cut more than you normally would. Don't cut in a very professional, skilled manner. So that is permitted. So if you want to cut back growth in your garden because things are getting too wild and too big, and Dafka, the purpose of you doing it is not to enhance the growth. You just wish that it wouldn't grow so much. You're allowed to do that in the Shemitah year. Now we get to mowing the lawn. Okay, mowing the lawn during Shemitah. The truth is that you can mow the lawn, but there are under certain conditions. Number one, ideally you plant grass 3 months before Shemitah, which we spoke about. So the grass can take root before Shemitah, if not at least 1 month before. That's coming up very soon. Number two, one can be lenient and mow the grass because Grass is not trees, so it's only an Isur Drabanan. Okay, number two, the purpose of mowing is not to make the grass grow, but to keep it cut for aesthetic purposes. You want it to look beautiful, like this mowed baseball field that we have here in the picture. It is best to mow on a regular basis, because if you only mow from time to time, it does cause the grass to grow more. And it's best not to mow yellow patches, which certainly cause more growth. But if something, again, if you're cutting just for aesthetic purposes, then you could do this on a regular basis during Shnat HaShemitah. Okay, we're going to skip this for right now. Psik b'shvi'it. Let's go to watering the garden. So any questions about pruning at this point? If you have any questions, feel free to ask. Now we move on to watering in your garden. Are you allowed to water during the Shemitah year? This is an Isur Drabanan, Hashkaya. And we'll see here, let's go to the second source. The first Mishnah, Masachem Moed Katan Perek Aleph, Mishnah Aleph says, Mashkin Beit HaShlachin b'moedu b'shvi'it. You're allowed to water a Beit HaShlachin. That's a field that needs a lot of water during Chol HaMoed and during Shnat HaShemitah. Now, why are you allowed to do this? So the Tiferet Yisrael explains. It says, Av she'asur b'avodat karka, even though you're not allowed to do work generally in the field in the seventh year, al kol panim hashkaha rak midrabanan asur. This is only prohibited midrabanan, rabbinically. Mishum hefsed hitiru. And again, because of loss, you're allowed to water the garden. So the Rambam paskins this way: Mashkin beit hashlachin b'shvit v'yisadeh hazriah shetzamcha bioter. You can plant in places that you can water in places that need a lot of water. And again, the Rambam explained, we saw this source earlier in Halakha Yud, if you don't do this, it's going to cause everything's going to die. So you're allowed to water. Now, logic dictates, first of all, that you should water differently in different seasons. You don't have to water in the winter, but you water in the summer when things are very, very dry. Now, the Chazon Ish is quoted as saying that makom hefsed she'amud kol eitz yesh lismoch lakel b'chol elo ach tzarich lishkol kol avoda v'avoda im yesh bazeh chashash she'amud eitz v'chol she'enu ela haracha asur. Chazon Ish is, wow, he's being very specific. You can only water if it's going to really, prevent death of the tree. This is a very stringent opinion. And Rav Karlitz in his Chut Shani explains that he doesn't think this is what the Chazon Ish really means. What he basically says is that when it comes to watering, that you're allowed to water on a regular basis, okay? Even if there's not great concern about pseida, you're allowed to water. You can water. You don't need to be so concerned that something. It's only in a time when the tree might actually die. And Halakha l'maaseh, we have here a summary from Yalkut Yosef, a number of different cases that one should know about. Number one, hashka'a asura b'shvi'it. Generally, you're not allowed to water b'shvi'it. But if you have a garden, you have a field that needs more water than just rainwater, then you're allowed to water. Okay, or if you're watering to prevent loss to the tree or to growth, and nezek, damage is going to be caused, you're allowed to water. Some say you should water on a less regular basis. You normally water every week, water every 2 weeks, water every day, water every other day. And some say no, you should. It doesn't matter. You could water with regularity. Now, desha shenizra linoi. Okay. What about grass? Can you water grass? Some say you shouldn't water it regularly every week. Only when you see that it's losing its lushness, its greenness. Depends on the climate, it depends on the place. Some say because you could water all the time, and it doesn't matter. Now, what about? So we see here he's bringing both opinions. Halakha l'maaseh, we say that you can water on a regular basis, but try to spread out the watering. Okay, try to spread it out a little bit. What about the water that comes from your air conditioner units, right? The answer is you're actually allowed to put that. The tzinur can be over plants. It's not a problem. Okay, and this is obviously watering flower pots inside your house is also permitted, as we spoke about that. Anything inside your house, you can do anything you want. And now, what about flower pots outside your house, in the garden, on the roof, in the merpesed? Again, it's the same thing as if it were in the ground. You could water, just try to spread out the watering a little bit, but otherwise it's permitted. You could water, as much as you want during each watering time. Rabbi Ramon mentioned here that grass generally needs to be watered once every 10 days for 90 minutes. Again, but it depends on the climate, depends on the situation. So watering, you can water a little bit less regular than usual, but with as much water as you want. Okay, what about watering on a timer? Is this better or is this worse? The answer is it's better, because you're not even doing a particular action. So if you use a timer, you can water regularly, no problem. Just make sure to set it up before Shemitah. Okay, now fertilizing. Okay, fertilizing. This is another rabbinic prohibition. One should use fast release fertilizer. This is an example where you have to prepare your garden before Shemitah. You may not fertilize during the Shemitah year, but you can put out stuff before Shemitah, and then it will release at a slow basis throughout the year. Okay, so this is an area where you want to get your garden ready to go before Shemitah. Weeding is another example. Okay, should weeding be permitted during Shemitah? This is called ניכוש. When it comes to weeding, if you don't take out weeds, it's not going to ruin your garden. There's no hefsed when it comes to weeding. It's ugly, it's annoying, but it doesn't prevent, affect the survival of your trees. And I hear a picture of it's called, I think, a hogweed or something, with these huge weeds. So one should really not weed during Shemitah because it does not affect the survival of the plants. If you need to remove weeds, better to cut them than pull out the whole stem. Don't pull out the whole stem from the ground. That's even worse. But one could remove weeds for aesthetic purposes, if needed. One should try to do this with a shinui, not on a regular basis. But really, if you prepare your garden before Shemitah, also if you you could put out some chemicals. Again, make sure that they are healthy chemicals and not dangerous, that will prevent weeds from growing during Shnat HaShemitah.
Rabbi, a question on that.
Sure.
The weeds push out the regular trees, and so it actually is not just aesthetic. It will kill the others the weeds will overpower. So what do you do in that instance?
Do you feel that the weeds will affect your other trees in that way?
Well, the last 10 years have shown that.
Really? Okay, so that would be a case where you can remove weeds if you feel it's affecting, if there's hefsed, if you feel it's affecting your tree's abilities to to grow and to stay healthy, then you can weed in that instance. Okay, but if you can try to do as much as you can before Shemitah, you may want to also consider putting down some form of pesticides against weeds. Again, I don't love all these chemicals, but you can do that. That's a better way of dealing with it than cutting this stuff. But again, if it is affecting, if there's hefsed, then you are allowed to do it. The same thing is true as pesticides. You're permitted to use pesticides to protect the tree to get rid of bugs, but not growth hormones to strengthen the tree. But again, if you're seeing anything now that needs maintenance, do it now before the Shemitah year, and then you don't need to worry. Okay, I have two final slides here, which are summary slides. Okay, so let's go over this way everyone's got the full picture. Short summary from Torahland, then I have a summary here from Pruning Halakha. So number one, planting and sowing are forbidden during Shemitah. And we said this is true whether it's in flower pots, whether this is planting, we spoke about this last week, actual trees, or planting seeds, or planting flowers. All of these types of planting are prohibited during Shemitah. However, you can plant inside your house. Watering, irrigation is permitted during Shemitah, but only the amount necessary for proper maintenance of the vegetation. We saw other opinions which said that you can water, but just do it a little bit less regularly, okay? And ideally, you water with a time clock, a timer. I have a timer for my garden in the back, but not in the front, and I'm just gonna put in a timer, and this way I don't need to worry about it, and I'll set it before the Shemitah year, and I don't need to worry. Fertilization must be performed before Shemitah. We recommend the use of slow-release fertilizers or controlled-release fertilizers before Shemitah begins. Weeds and weeding. Permitted when weeds threaten to take over the garden's plants or when there is concern that pests will find refuge in the weeds. We recommend the use of anti-sprouting agents or lawn weed herbicides. A motorized Scout weed whacker may be used, but is forbidden to till or turn the soil. Again, so in a case of need, as Jake asked, you can get rid of some weeds. Pruning bushes and hedges. When the hedge is full, it is permitted to prune it to maintain its existing shape. We spoke about this. Pruning linoi. Linoi is for aesthetic reasons. However, it is forbidden to prune hedges with gaps, and this is an important point here, and ragged edges in order to fill in the gaps or enhance the hedge's growth. Pruning should be performed with a shinui. Sometimes, the prints, you want them to get bigger and fill in the spaces. You don't want your neighbor to see what's going on in your garden. That's a problem with pruning for that reason. But if it's something that overgrows and it prevents people from walking in a certain place, or it's not beautiful anymore, you can prune a little bit. What about shaping and pruning trees? This should be done before or after Shemitah. It can be done during Shemitah only when branches are dangerously protruding close to the sidewalk, road, or electrical wires, and pruning the trees would prevent accidents. Pruning should be performed with a shinui. Okay, so get all of this done before Shemitah. Mowing the grass, it is permitted to mow a full lawn as usual. However, it's forbidden to mow a lawn with bald spots to encourage growth to fill in those spots. Number 8, non-agricultural dirt work activities are permitted. Examples include paving roads and walkways, building supporting walls. However, garden soil may not be used to fill in supporting walls, for example. Okay. Potted plants indoors we spoke about may be tended to as in non-Shemitah years. However, only the minimum care enough to keep the plant alive may be given to the following types of potted plants. Plants and planters with a volume exceeded 330 liters, we didn't speak about that. 2, plants under the open sky, like on your mirpeset, on your roof, or plants with branches hanging above the ground or under the open sky. So there, those could be عציצים, nikuvim, or not nikuvim. For those, minimum care. And all the laws that we saw 1 through 7 here apply to those, 1 through 8 apply to those. But again, something inside your house. So the more you bring everything inside the house, the less you need to be concerned about Shemitah with those things. Just to Pruning Halakha here, let's see if he adds anything that we did not cover. Let me just see here. Okay, I'm not seeing anything right here that we missed. So we are going to, I'm going to stop the share here. And if anybody has any specific questions that they want to ask about gardening, I've recorded this year. I recorded the previous one. They are up on, they'll both be up on YouTube. And you could refer to these as, as reference points. And if you have any other questions, feel free to reach out or to ask questions. And Be'ezrat Hashem, we should be zochet to fulfill the mitzvot of Shemitah, both in terms of what we eat, but also in our gardens. Like, this really is an amazing opportunity to.
The Chazan from Central Synagogue, Sydney. My friend Gary